dead girl and heals the sick woman. Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," he said. "Don't bother the teacher anymore." Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe and she will be healed." When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. "Stop wailing," Jesus said. "She is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened.
Good. Well, we're carrying on our series in Luke's Gospel. Just to repeat what I've said before, we're not working as we often do through all of the passages in this particular series, but we're looking at encounters that different individuals have with Jesus. And I guess one of the main purposes being for us to observe Jesus, to listen to him, to watch him, and to get to know him better in order to sort of help feed our relationship and our understanding. Just say, let me know if there's anything I can do, Luke, just to stop the echoing. If you're reading along, we did say maybe to read a couple of chapters a week, just so you get a feel for the whole of Luke as well. So if you're doing that, it's chapters 11 and 12 this week. So we're about halfway through this series now. I should just say I haven't seen Richard this morning. How was it yesterday, Richard? Richard was at Wembley yesterday watching Luton Town trying to get into the Premier League. How was it for you, Richard? Bad for your health. Yeah. I've lost my voice. Have you? Yeah, I was just mindful of Richard and the ups and downs of watching a game like that with Premier League dangling, in front of you as a reward. I didn't realise, I heard after the game, that Luton hadn't been in the top division, you can tell me if this is right, Richard, for 31 years, was the commentators were saying. And during that 31 years had dropped. There's sort of four main football divisions, and they dropped down and out of the bottom fourth one into this sort of league that everyone's desperately trying to get in to those top four divisions. So they've been down there and then worked their way all the way back up to the top. And there's a phrase, and it's not a very good phrase in terms of leading into this poor lady in this story, but there's a phrase that's often used of like 31 years of pain. It's very dramatic, isn't it? It's only a game of football, but it's that sort of feeling of the football. Oh, look, Richard's in such agony. He's left. But this lady, and we'll spend most of our time actually with the woman in this story. 12 years, I think we're told in verse 43. A woman was there, the crowd around Jesus, a woman there who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years. But no one could heal her. And if you may, I don't know if your Bibles have a footnote, it says that many manuscripts also have the words, "and she had spent all she had on doctors." So as with a number of these encounters, we've got another person here whose lot in life, is incredibly tough, a huge sort of burden to bear, an exhausting condition, perhaps painful, I don't know, that's not mentioned. But again, in terms of, a bit like with the leper of a few weeks ago, in terms of the Old Testament law, would probably have been somebody that was labelled and viewed as being unclean, which would have had some implications, again, in terms of social interaction and sort of isolation. So again, it's hard for us to know all of these things for certain, but there's a real sense of the need of this lady and the desperation of her. I think, again, if she was under those sort of conditions where she would have been away from people or limited in some way, the fact that she's there speaks perhaps of her desperation, the fact that she's in the crowd. Maybe again, like others, the word about Jesus we know spread, as Dave said, when you've got these sort of things happening. I'm not sure if there would have been anybody left that wouldn't have heard of this Rabbi Jesus and the things he was doing. So she's there as well. I think for a woman to come out and to touch the garment of a man or a rabbi, again, I imagine was just not done. So it's, again, there's a bit of a window into the sense of her life and the desperation that she had. It's interesting, isn't it, in verse 45, Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And I was just reflecting on that. I thought, if Jesus had not asked that question, we would never have heard of this woman, I don't think. I imagine for her to touch the edge of Jesus' garment as he passed, to be immediately healed, I imagine she would have slid away, or I don't know. But the fact that Jesus asked the question, "Who touched me?" has led now to her story being included by Luke and some of the other gospel writers. We're told that they all denied it. Not me, and then Peter, again, you can certainly imagine someone like Peter saying, "Well, Master, look at the people. They're crowding around you, pressing against you. Of course, people have touched you." And it's quite an interesting sort of moment, isn't it? I guess as Jesus is waiting, sort of remind me of those moments in school years ago when something's happened, somebody said something. There's a few teachers in the room this morning, and the whole class is stopped. And who was it? Who did that? Or who said that? You sort of wait, and the silence in the classroom. I remember that, just waiting. Is someone going to crack? Is someone going to own up? And then the whole class are going to be in detention, that sort of thing. But you imagine the silence. Who touched me? No, Jesus is insistent. Somebody has touched me. And waiting. And then verse 47, the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. And then in the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. This sort of, I imagine, trying to fly under the radar, suddenly has got the ears of everybody and essentially shares something of her story. I mean, we're given the summary version here, but she tells why she touched him. She's explained perhaps something of her life, and then gave testimony to the fact that the moment she touched, the bleeding stopped, the pain, presumably, as well, I imagine there's some pain, must have ceased immediately. She knew she'd been healed. And then Jesus' pronouncement, verse 48, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." And you haven't got the exasperated teacher, waiting for somebody to own up. Nothing of that with Jesus, but this public now declaration in front of everybody, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." We've said along the way that although we're looking at the encounters, it is good to still keep an eye, obviously, on what Luke is doing and why he's putting these incidents together the way that he is. And I think what we're going to look at a little bit this morning is that Luke is wanting, I think, his readers to see the right response, the model response to Jesus. It comes up in a number of the situations and encounters. We've said before, we often see the religious leaders and their reactions to Jesus, sort of looking down their nose at him. Why is he hanging out with these people? If he was really a prophet, he would know this. So even though we're seeing amazing miracles, as we've said, you've got a group of people still nitpicking, opposing him, trying to trip him up, those sorts of things. In the previous story to this, where Jesus sends the demons into the pigs, the people in that region, I think verses 37, 38, beg Jesus to leave them, to go away. But throughout these incidents, we've got these responses that I think Luke is showing this is the right way. This is the way to respond to Jesus. And so this woman really is a model. Faith in Jesus, trust in Jesus is the right response. And we see in this story what that faith actually brings. Now, I'm going to just for 2-3 minutes, I hope I'm not going to bore you. You may say too late, we're already there. But there's a little bit of a technicality that I'd like to just sort of give you a little window into the things that have been going on in my mind this week as you try to sort of wonder what's going on and what Luke is doing. There's a bit of a puzzle here. And basically, if you look down with me, it'll only be a couple of minutes, so don't worry too much. But in verse 48, Jesus' statement, "Daughter, your faith has healed you, go in peace." The word that Jesus uses here for healed you can be used in two different ways. So it's the same Greek word, but it's translated and used in two different ways in different times. So it can mean your faith has healed you, or your faith has made you well. So it can have that sort of idea in it. But equally, it can be translated, your faith has saved you. And one of the things that Bible translators have to do is to think, well, which does Jesus mean here? What's actually being said? How should we translate it? Is Jesus saying here, your faith has healed you, or is he saying your faith has saved you? And you'll see, because if you've got an NIV Bible, that you've got the words, your faith has healed you, that the translators of this version of the Bible have taken that option. And the only way to determine which you should translate anything like this, and there's a number of Greek words that have this sort of issue, they could mean this or that, the way to determine which way it should go is the context. So you read around it, you read what's going on, and you think, Jesus must be meaning that. That seems more likely. They're the sort of decisions that are being made. So let me just show you again. Sorry if you're drifting. Have a look at verse 43, because the word crops up there as well. Verse 43, a woman who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. So the word heal there, no one could heal her, is almost certainly heal, made well. Nobody could make her well. That's what fits that one best. It's there again in verse 47. Oh no, that's hard. Is it? Thanks, Mike. I'm glad you're paying attention. Yeah, so at the end of verse 47, she touched him and how she had been instantly healed. So the word's there again. And again, is it made well, healed, or is it saved? Well, it looks like healed. So we've got two either side that definitely the context says healed. And then we come to our verse and Jesus' words here, daughter, your faith has healed you. And you could say, well, she has been physically healed, so that's the most likely option. There are just two things to note, and this is where, for me, it becomes interesting, sorry. I was speaking to my daughter Ellie yesterday. She said she's gone to a board game cafe in Birmingham in the last week, a sort of coffee shop, and, she said their selection of board games is amazing, and she was introduced to a new game with Matty and others, and was telling me all about it. Very, very excited, a bit like a Luton fan yesterday, of the detail of this game and figuring this out and figuring that out. Well, that's where I am, sorry, with this verse. So verse 47, I hope you'll see why this matters in a minute. Two things that are interesting on this. Notice what Jesus says after he said the first bit. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. So it's interesting that his immediate next comment is to go in peace. Now, Jesus isn't ahead of his time. He's not in the 1970s now. It's not the way that you said goodbye to people, go in peace, that kind of thing. His words are far more loaded than that. So when he says go in peace, this word peace that he uses is loaded with meaning. It's about cessation of hostility between a person and God. It's the removal of that enmity, that war that's there between people and God. Peace is now the possession of this woman. And if you go back to Romans 5, where we were not too long ago, peace and a number of other words spin off this biblical notion of peace. It speaks about reconciliation. It speaks about restoration. It speaks about redemption, that Jesus has paid the price to redeem you, to bring you back, to create peace with God. It has within it the idea of salvation and the hope of glory that's ahead. So when Jesus says to her, go in peace, he's not just saying, keep warm and well fed, goodbye. He's saying she's leaving this encounter with him, having now received peace and all that it brings. She approached him with a medical condition and leaves the encounter justified, reconciled, restored, saved, forgiven. So that's the first thing that makes you think, I wonder if Jesus is simply talking here about the physical healing, or is he talking about her being saved? Go in peace. The second thing that's interesting in terms of weighing up this conundrum is that Jesus uses exactly this same phrase, word for word, in the encounter we were looking at last week. So have a glance back to chapter 7 and verse 47. And if you missed last week, a woman who was known for a sinful lifestyle, known in her town for whatever that lifestyle was, and she'd come before Jesus and had cried on his feet and wiped them with her hair and poured perfume on them and loved him much. And Jesus explaining what's happening here from verse 47 of chapter 7, he says, "Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown, but whoever has been forgiven little loves little." Then Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." The other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" And Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." So just the chapter before, word for word, same sentence, said to the woman with her sinful lifestyle that has been turned around by Jesus, exactly the same words spoken to the woman with bleeding. And in the previous episode, in chapter 7, there was no healing in that particular story. The woman had been forgiven and cleansed, her debt cancelled, and she leaves saved. Your faith has saved you. And she too goes in peace, restored, reconciled, redeemed, justified. So the woman in our story today has experienced an incredible miracle of healing. 12 years, nobody could sort the problem. There was no answer. We think she'd spent all of her money on physicians and doctors. There was nobody that could reverse this condition. And with a touch of Jesus' garment, she is immediately healed. But I wonder if Jesus is also saying that alongside that incredible change to her life, that something even greater that can't be seen, can it, by the naked eye? Something has happened in this woman's life. Her faith has saved her. She leaves restored, reconciled, redeemed, justified, saved in her walk with God as well. Now, in terms of Luke using this and some of the other incidences around, he seems to be urging that the right response to Jesus is for us to put our faith in him, wholehearted trust and faith in Jesus, which I put to you this morning is a big step. It's a big step for us to do that. It was a big step for her. I imagine that sort of reticence in front of the crowd, and again, wonder if she's done the right thing or is she in trouble. But for her to step forward in front of that crowd and to testify to what's happened, what her background was, why she put her hand on Jesus, and what happened to her was a big step for her. I think to go into school this week, and be open. I am a Christian. This is my story. This is my testimony. I have faith in Jesus Christ. That's a big step. I remember going to university and people sort of saying to me, make it clear from the get-go that you're a Christian. And I look back now, I've got a feeling I had really dodgy posters I put on my wall. I had a guitar. I played Christian music. Anyway, it may have been unwise, some of it. May have seemed a bit odd, some of it. But I wanted to make that step from the beginning and for people to know. And it's a big step. University now, or in your workplace or friendship group, to be that clear and open is a big step. But Luke is saying in all of the different responses to Jesus in these stories that this is the right response to Jesus, to put your faith in him. One of the reasons that we see such power and authority, Luke has almost paraded it. If you remember the Generation Game, it's almost like, sickness healed, leprosy healed, paralysis undone, withered hands straightened, storm stilled, thousands fed, unstoppable bleeding, testimony given to that. It's item after item. Luke is saying, put your faith in Jesus. It's the only sensible and wise response based on his power and his authority. And then alongside that, what we've seen in all of these incidences is the compassion of Jesus, reaching out and touching that leper. It's hard for us because we don't live in these times and know what it would have been like. But for Jesus to have done that for that man was astonishing, cleansing the unclean, eating with tax collectors and sinners, not just the Christian tax collectors and sinners, those who had become Christians, but their friends, to come near to them, to spend time with them, to eat with them, to love them. So we see his power and his authority. We see his compassion, the fact that he knows the details of our lives and comes close. The right response is faith in him. The centurion modelled that faith. This woman models that faith. And the other thing, and this is why it mattered, I think, to try and tease out, what is Jesus saying? Simply your faith has healed you, physically made you well, or is he saying more than that? The reason for that is I think Luke wants us to see that faith in Jesus not only makes sense, but look what it brings us. Through the experience of this woman, through the record of this, it's as if Luke is saying that to those of us that will read this and have trusted Jesus, your faith has saved you. Faith in Jesus brings this kind of salvation. Not only salvation from our sin, from our debt, as we saw last week with the woman, saving us from the consequences that our sins deserve, but saving us for relationship with God, saving us for peace with God, saving us for restored relationship with God, reconciliation with God, redemption, righteousness, and then future hope. There's something here, and such a big thing, isn't it, today, about our identity. There's something here that in terms of what Luke is saying, that when we put our faith in him, see your new identity. See who you now are. See the peace that you now have. See the salvation that is yours. It's one of the great things of, I'm sure there'll be 101 ways that we all meet different people. Mine tends to be through doing battle on the golf course, and you meet strangers and you play for a bit and then you talk and you ask a few questions. It's amazing how you get to know this person that started the day just as your sworn enemy, but now you know something of their history, something of their family, something of what they do. I've known people in their line of work that suddenly find out that the new colleague is an author or a TV actor or was in this show or that show or whatever. There's something beyond what you see on face value of our identity and what's there. And here's a woman who simply had this 12 years bleeding condition, who leaves the encounter knowing that she now goes in peace with God and has been saved. There's so much more to her now, so much more to you and to me if we put our faith in him. Now, I want to just draw these things to a close this morning by asking the question, how can I know that all of this is truly mine, that this is real, that this sort of salvation and peace will go on and on into eternity? On Easter Sunday, I don't expect you to remember, but I mentioned about the difference of response of Cliff Richard and Billy Graham when asked the same question. That ringing any bells? What if when you die, the interviewer asked them both, there's nothing? Or it turns out one of the other religions was right. It's an important question, isn't it? If I'm going to give my entire life and put my faith in Jesus, and in chapter 9 we see Jesus talking about denying ourselves, taking up our cross, following him, it's everything. If I'm going to do that, how do I know that when I die there won't just be nothing? Jesus is promising remarkable things, but how do I know that he actually has the power and the authority to be dependable the other side of death? And this is where we move suddenly in this story to verse 49. As Jesus is still speaking, so the incident with the woman is just literally coming to an end. And some come from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader, with the message, "Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore." And again, these are great incidences to try to sort of imagine. It's so understandable, isn't it, that line, "Don't bother the teacher anymore." The situation that Jesus originally was heading to Jairus' house has now reached its conclusion before arrival. I had a really, I don't even know what the word is to describe it in terms of playing golf with somebody in the last couple of weeks. It was a doubles match. We were absolutely destroyed, terribly. Like, I don't think I've ever suffered such a big defeat. But we were walking back to the clubhouse with them. And again, somebody I'd got to know a little bit, got to know a bit about his job, and he'd asked a few questions to me. He'd asked a bit about family and children and so on. And as we were walking back to the clubhouse, I said to him, "What about you? Do you have children?" And he was retired now, he'd got grandchildren as well, I knew. Well, yeah, he'd got grandchildren. And he just said, it's always a difficult question to answer. And then he said, "We had 3 children. And you sort of just immediately know then, don't you, something of the pain of which he's about to speak. We had 3 children. You can't imagine, can you, what it was like to be Jairus, hearing this news. We know he was desperate. Goodness, he was desperate. We're told he ran, verse 41, to Jesus. He fell at Jesus' feet. He pleaded with him to come to his house. His only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. But to hear these words, "Your daughter is dead," verse 49, "don't bother the teacher anymore," must have been just crushing, unimaginably crushing, as it was for this golfer. There's nothing a teacher can do, is there now? You know, however good his teaching, however insightful and wise and just mind-blowing, there's nothing even really that an extraordinary healer can do now. You know, leprosy and a bleeding condition and Simon's mother-in-law's fever and a paralyzed man. I mean, they're all one category of incredible, miraculous ability, but even that now is no good. How can you and I know that Jesus' promises of peace with God and of being saved and salvation and hope, how can we know that can hold true even with the small matter of our death coming? Well, Jesus' response is astonishing in verse 15. He says, "Don't be afraid, Jairus, just believe, and she will be healed." When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. "Stop wailing," Jesus said. "She is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, "Child, get up." Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. We shouldn't be confused here by this Jesus using the language of sleep. The group that came to Jairus was convinced she was dead. The people at the house who are mourning know that she's died. Luke, who's a doctor by background, in verse 55, says that her spirit returned to her body, indicating that in terms of his view and his research and his evidence, she had absolutely died. And Jesus here deliberately uses the language that the Bible sometimes uses to talk about those that have died. It talks about them sleeping, the dead sleeping. And the reason that the Bible does that is that there is an end point in God's plans that theologians call the general resurrection, when all will be raised. All who have lived and died will be raised, hence the term sleep. That those that die in this life, in a sense, sleep, waiting to be woken at the final and general resurrection. And so again, what we're seeing through this, not only the amazing power and authority of Jesus to raise the dead, but we're seeing that our hope in Jesus as Christians, those that have thrown a whole lot in with him, is not a leap in the dark. There's no sense in which we cross our fingers and hope that Jesus will deliver on his promises of peace and salvation in the future after our death. Now, when Jesus is confronted with leprosy or paralysis, unstoppable bleeding or a withered hand, he simply speaks and the human body changes. And in the same way, when Jesus is confronted by death, he simply speaks, "My child, get up." Again, what Luke is helping us to see here is that Jesus' power and authority have no equal and they have no limit, whether it's to do with life or death. He brings salvation to this woman with bleeding. He brings peace to the woman with bleeding, and this includes resurrection to eternal life. So you see in the Gospels, whether it's the boy in Luke 7, again just a couple of chapters earlier, the young man who died, whether it's him or Jairus, his 12-year-old daughter, or Lazarus who's been in the tomb 3 or 4 days, it makes no difference. He has complete power to speak and reverse the effects of death. Whether it's you or me, Jesus has power over our death. Jesus even said, "I have the power to lay down my life and the power to take it back up again." So you see, in the middle of these two stories, we've got this theme of faith in Jesus being the only sensible and wise response, to put our faith in him, to throw our lot in with him, knowing that he has power and authority over life and death and will bring salvation and peace. And I want to just finish as a linked thought on that. I want to ask you as we close today, do you see what you have in Jesus? Do I see what I have in him? I don't know if any of you still use, I'm looking at maybe the older people in the room, do you ever still use the phrase, "You don't know you're born"? Is David Burton in the room? I've just, for some reason, Dave came to mind when I was thinking about it. And I've also attached a Yorkshire accent, you see. When we were, younger and kids, and you complain about something, didn't you? And someone who's older, "You don't know you're born." When I was a lad, you don't know what you have. I wonder, as we finish today, maybe that's the question, Christian, do you know what you have? Do I know? The woman leading a sinful life saw it. She wept with tears of joy because she saw what she had. She'd been loved much by Jesus, and so she loved him. She saw what she had. She was willing to go into that hostile environment, the Pharisees' home, surrounded by people, as we said the other week, around the edges of the room, looking at this conversation. They all knew her. They knew her lifestyle. But she walked into that hostile environment and publicly loved Jesus because she knew what she had. And Levi, the tax collector, hated as a traitor and a thief. Levi, like Peter, and I suspect the leper, the paralytic, this woman and Jairus, Levi rejoiced, praised God, left everything and followed Jesus because he knew what he had. He knew who Jesus was and he knew what Jesus had done. And so I wonder, do you know? Do I know? Do we really see? We need that sort of miracle, don't we? Some of us need miracles in our eyes, physically, but just that miracle of having the cataract, the spiritual cataract, as it were, removed to see what we actually have. Daughter, son, your faith has saved you. Go in peace.